Warchief's son found an old widow dying in the Dryland heat. One act of kindness shifted their paths. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. The sun beat down relentlessly on the dry desert floor. The air was thick with heat, shimmering like waves over the land. The once proud earth now cracked and parched, a barren wasteland where little life could endure. In the midst of this unforgiving terrain, an old widow struggled to keep moving. Her clothes were tattered, her face a map of years spent weathering harsh conditions. Her skin was weathered and cracked, her once vibrant eyes now dim with exhaustion. She had been walking for hours, perhaps days, with no clear destination in sight. She had no water, no food, just the unrelenting desire to survive. But the sun had stolen her strength, and now, as the scorching heat intensified, her body began to give in. She stumbled, her feet dragging along the dry ground, and soon collapsed under a small, gnarled tree that offered little shade. The world around her began to blur, and the sounds of the desert faded away. As she lay there, struggling for each breath, she thought of her past, a life long gone, full of love and loss. Her once thriving farm, now abandoned, her family scattered or taken by the unforgiving hands of time. The days of hope were behind her now, and all she could do was wait for the end. But fate had other plans. Far in the distance, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. The figure moved with purpose, cutting through the barren landscape like a shadow in the heat. As the rider grew closer, the widow could make out the outline of a man, tall, strong, and mounted on a powerful steed. He was no ordinary traveler, but a warrior, his movements precise and controlled, his presence commanding. The rider, a son of a great warchief, had been on a mission of his own, scouting the desert for signs of his tribe's enemies. He had been trained to survive in this harsh land, to endure its dangers and navigate its challenges. But as he rode, something caught his eye, a small figure lying motionless beneath the tree. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen the signs before, a person in distress, left behind by the unforgiving desert. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward. As he approached, he saw the old widow's shallow breaths, her frail body barely clinging to life. He dismounted and kneeled beside her, his eyes scanning her face, noting the lines of age and suffering. He knew this could be a trap, a ploy to lure him into the open. But something inside him urged him to help. The widow's hand twitched, and for a moment, he thought she might have the strength to rise on her own. But she fell back again, her body too weak to fight the harshness of the land. His heart softened as he placed his hand on her shoulder. He had been raised to protect, to honor life, no matter the circumstances. This woman, a stranger, deserved his kindness. With a steady hand, he reached for his water skin and gently coaxed her to drink. Her lips trembled as she took a few sips, the cool water reviving her, just enough to open her eyes. She stared up at him, confused, her mind racing to understand what was happening. He spoke softly, reassuring her that she was safe now, that he would help her. The widow, though exhausted, could not fathom the depth of his kindness. She had never experienced such compassion, especially not in this desolate place. The warrior's act of mercy would forever alter both of their lives, setting in motion a chain of events that would change their destinies. As she regained her strength, the warrior helped her onto his horse, guiding her through the desert toward the nearest settlement. She could not have known then that this simple act of kindness would forever shift their paths, leading them both to a future that neither could have imagined. The heat of the Dryland was still oppressive, but with the warrior by her side, the widow felt a glimmer of hope, something she had not felt in years. As the warrior carefully guided the widow on horseback through the desert, the harsh, dry winds bit at their faces, but the air was cool enough now for the woman to feel the faint stirrings of life return to her limbs. She was no longer certain whether she was dreaming or alive, but something about the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her comforted her. She had been in this desert for days, fighting to stay awake, to stay alive, and now, As her eyes grew heavy, she realized she was being carried away from death. The warrior's voice was a calm murmur beside her, offering reassurances she didn't fully understand, but they were comforting all the same. "We will make it," he promised, his hand steady on the reins. He guided the horse carefully, eyes ever watchful for dangers that could strike at any moment, from hostile forces to wild creatures of the desert. Despite his calm demeanor, the warrior knew the dangers were far from over. There were still miles to go before they reached safety, and his mind kept flicking to the tribe he had left behind and the deep responsibilities that awaited him. He was the son of a war chief, a leader in his own right, and though he had wandered from his duties for a time, the weight of his family's legacy was always with him. For now, though, his focus remained on the fragile woman beside him, a stranger who had found her way into his path and into his life in a way that was impossible to ignore. She was an enigma to him, this widow, her past as scarred as her body, her face a mask of quiet suffering. Yet there was something strong in her eyes, something resilient that mirrored his own spirit. She had been abandoned by the world, left to die alone in the desert, but here she was, alive, and in his care. He knew that this small act of kindness, helping her when he could have left her behind, would change everything. The world wasn't kind to those who were weak, and yet he had chosen to show mercy. The widow, for her part, was overwhelmed with a sense of guilt, an unfamiliar feeling that began to gnaw at her. She wasn't used to being helped, to being dependent on others for survival. She had lived her life in isolation, driven by the need to fend for herself, to take what she could in. A world that demanded so much. But now, as the warrior helped her to remain steady on the horse, her heart swelled with an emotion she hadn't felt in years, gratitude. The faint glimmer of hope she had once carried in her heart now stirred again, as if the warrior's simple kindness had rekindled the spark of life in her. She didn't know what awaited her on the other side of the desert, but for the first time in a long while, she dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could build something again. The warrior noticed the shift in her demeanor and couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had led, what kind of woman she was before the desert had claimed her. He had never encountered a person like her before, someone so capable of enduring the harshest conditions, yet so broken by the world. It was as though the desert had worn her down, but beneath it all, there was something worth saving. As they rode on, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the endless sand dunes. The journey was quiet, save for the sounds of their horses' hooves crunching on the dry earth and the distant call of birds overhead. The warrior began to think of his tribe and the people who depended on him. He had left them behind to fulfill a personal mission, to prove something to himself, but now, he felt the pull of duty once more. He was a warrior, yes, but his heart had always been torn between his responsibilities to his people and his desire for freedom. Now, as he looked down at the widow, he realized that his path had already changed. He was no longer the solitary figure he once was. He was a protector, a guide, whether he liked it or not. The widow's hand gripped the reins tightly as the warrior spoke once more, his voice steady and firm. "We will reach the settlement soon," he said, his gaze focused on the horizon. "There, you will be safe." Safe. The word lingered in the widow's mind like a distant memory, one that seemed so foreign, yet so necessary. It had been so long since she had felt that way, safe, cared for. It felt almost impossible, but as the warrior led her through the desert, she began to believe in the possibility of a new life, one that didn't have to be lived alone. The journey ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, the widow could see a glimmer of something beyond survival, perhaps a chance at redemption, a chance to heal. But the warrior knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges. There would be more than just the desert to contend with. As they neared the settlement, his mind raced with the questions he had not yet answered. Who was this woman, really? And what had brought her to this place of desperation? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and that reason would shape both of their futures, in ways neither could have predicted. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the warrior guided the widow toward the settlement. The landscape had started to change, the harsh desert sands giving way to the dry, cracked earth of the plains. The winds had calmed, but the lingering heat still clung to everything. They had been traveling for hours, and though the widow's strength had returned somewhat, she remained silent, her thoughts drifting. She wondered what awaited her in this unknown place, whether she would be welcomed or turned away. She had been cast out by her own people, and now, here she was, riding beside a stranger who had shown her more kindness than anyone in years. The warrior, on the other hand, was already planning for the challenges that lay ahead. He had lived among his people long enough to know that the road to acceptance was never easy, especially when it came to outsiders. The widow, no matter how much he had helped her, would still be a stranger in their midst. His tribe valued loyalty and honor above all else, and a person's worth was often determined by their actions, not by who they were. As they neared the settlement, the warrior's thoughts turned to his own responsibilities. His warchief father had always expected him to lead with strength and wisdom, but now, for the first time, he felt torn between duty and compassion. He had always been trained to be a warrior, to fight and defend, but this situation was different. He was helping a woman, a widow, who had been left to die in the desert. She was not a soldier, not someone he could fight beside, but someone who needed protection and care. He had never imagined that his path would lead him to this. The settlement came into view, a small cluster of buildings against the backdrop of the plains. It was nothing like the bustling towns to the east, but it was home to a few families, traders, and travelers who had made a living in the harsh land. As they approached, the warriors signaled for the widow to hold on tight. He had seen the eyes of the people in the settlement before. They were wary, always watching for threats. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak, especially now, when he was bringing an outsider into their midst. They were close enough now for the widow to see the dusty roads, the wooden structures that lined the settlement, and the few people scattered about, going about their evening chores. The warrior slowed the horse as they entered, making his presence known to the people, his stoic expression revealing little. The widow glanced around, taking in the unfamiliar faces. She could feel the weight of their stares, their judgments. She was no longer a woman of worth, just a stranger with nothing to offer. The warrior stopped in front of a small, worn-down building, the doors open as if waiting for them. "This is where you will stay," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "The people here will not be kind at first, but they will come to see you as one of us." The widow nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude, but also a deep uncertainty. She had no idea what kind of life awaited her here, but she had little choice but to trust the warrior. He had shown her mercy when no one else had, and for that, she was willing to follow him. He dismounted first, then helped her down from the horse, his strong hands steadying her as she stumbled slightly. The warrior's eyes were scanning the settlement, his every movement calculated, his posture alert. He knew the dangers of living in a place like this, especially for someone as vulnerable as the widow. There was no telling who would accept her or who would look down on her. The warrior turned to face her, his expression softening. "For a moment, I must go," he said, his voice filled with a sense of finality. "There are things I need to tend to with the tribe, but you are safe here. I will return soon to check on you." The widow's heart fluttered as she realized he was leaving. She wanted to protest, to ask him to stay, but she knew better. She had been alone for so long, abandoned by everyone who once cared for her. The warrior's kindness had been a fleeting moment of mercy, and now, as he turned to leave, she felt the weight of her solitude once again. "Thank you," she whispered, though he was already walking away. He glanced back over his shoulder, offering her a brief nod before disappearing into the distance. The widow stood there for a moment, taking in the vast, open space around her. This small, desolate settlement was now her home, a place where she could start over, if only she had the courage to do so. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her, hope. The path ahead would not be easy, but at least she was no longer alone. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the land, the widow stepped forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed the widow's arrival in the settlement were marked by a silent struggle. The warrior's promise to return quickly was a comfort, but each hour stretched out longer than she had anticipated. She spent her days in the small, dimly lit room he had led her to, trying to get used to the new life that awaited her. The widow had never been one for idleness, but there was little she could do in this unfamiliar place. The people in the settlement gave her wary glances, keeping their distance as she adjusted to life among them. Most of them had lived harsh lives on the frontier and had little patience for strangers, especially someone like her, an outsider, a woman who had no one. Still, she did her best to fit in. Each morning, she would step out of the small building and quietly observe the goings-on in the settlement. The men worked the land, tending to crops and livestock, while the women gathered supplies and cared for their homes. There was no warmth in their gestures, but there was a routine to it all, a quiet rhythm that made her feel, for the first time in many years, that perhaps she was in a place where she could survive. She had been a part of this land before, back when her family had tended their farm, but it had been a lifetime ago. Now, with only the clothes on her back and the promise of a new beginning, she was a stranger once again. Despite the coldness she felt from the others, she was beginning to settle into her new role. One day, as she worked on cleaning a small patch of land near the settlement, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see the warrior approaching, his presence as commanding as ever, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a shift, as if he had returned to her not as a protector, but as someone who had come to find his place in this strange new world. "I knew you would be here," he said softly, offering her a slight smile. The widow nodded in response, unsure of what to say. She had spent so many days without speaking, without companionship, that her words felt strange in her mouth. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice gentle, but with a firmness that reflected his warrior's spirit. "Surviving," she replied, her voice rasping slightly from lack of use. "But I am getting used to it." The warrior surveyed her work for a moment, then turned his gaze back to her. "You are stronger than you think," he said, his words carrying the weight of truth. The widow had never thought of herself as strong. She had only ever done what was necessary to survive, to make it through the hardships life had thrown her way. But his words sparked something deep inside her. She hadn't felt strong in so long, not since the days when she had run her own farm, cared for her own family. Now, everything was different. And yet, as she looked at him, standing there like a silent guardian, she realized that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had thought. "I'm not sure I am," she said quietly, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even her. The warrior looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes softening. "You are. You have made it this far, and that is no small feat." She met his gaze, wondering what it was about him that made her feel both small and powerful at the same time. He was a warrior, raised to be a leader, a protector of his people. She was a widow, lost and abandoned by the world. And yet, here they were, two people brought together by fate in the middle of this desolate land. The warrior shifted slightly, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, a silent reminder of who he was. "The settlement is still wary of you," he said, his tone growing more serious. "But they will come to accept you, in time. The kindness I showed you, it will be enough to prove your worth here." The widow nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was needed. A deeper trust, perhaps, a bond that went beyond mere survival. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, but sincere. "For everything." He nodded, but didn't speak for a moment. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting the land in a soft glow. "There is more to this land than just survival," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And more to us than just what we've been. We all have our burdens to carry, but together, we can change the course of our lives." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The widow couldn't help but wonder if he truly believed in those words, or if he was simply trying to offer her hope. But in that moment, she didn't care. She wanted to believe in them. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. She stood taller, her back straightening with the weight of his words. Maybe there was something more for her here, something beyond mere survival. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but with the warrior by her side, she felt like she could face whatever came next. The evening passed in silence, the two of them standing there, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The land was quiet, but there was a stirring in the air, a shift in the world around them. For the first time in a long while, the widow felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The following days after their quiet conversation by the fading light of the desert sun were filled with subtle changes. The widow, though still a stranger to the settlement, found herself adjusting to the rhythm of daily life, a life that was at once familiar and completely new. The warrior's presence remained a steady force in her world. Every so often, he would check in on her, ensuring she was safe, his eyes soft with an understanding she had come to trust. Despite the tension in the settlement, where the other residents still regarded her with suspicion, she felt something shift inside her. Perhaps it was the sense of belonging that grew in the small, unspoken gestures of the warrior's people. They didn't yet accept her fully, but they didn't push her away either. The quiet warrior had kept his promise. Slowly, life became a little more bearable, and the widow began to find her place in this strange new world. One afternoon, after working to clear a patch of land beside her new home, she sat down beneath the shade of a nearby tree to rest. The heat of the day was still heavy in the air, but a slight breeze offered her some comfort. She had come to enjoy these moments of quiet reflection, when everything was still and the desert around her seemed almost peaceful. But it was in this moment of solitude that she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a brief instant, panic washed over her. She hadn't seen many of the settlers take interest in her work, and the warrior had been gone for several hours, tending to matters of his own. She looked up, her breath catching in her chest as a figure emerged from the distance. It was one of the settlers, a tall man with rough hands and the hardened look of someone who had spent a lifetime on the frontier. He didn't smile as he approached, but his eyes held a level of curiosity, perhaps even pity. The widow stood slowly, dusting off her clothes. She hadn't expected anyone to come speak with her today. "You're the one he brought in, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. She hesitated. For a moment, unsure how to respond. The warrior had made it clear that the settlers would be watching her, waiting to see what kind of woman she was. She didn't want to be seen as weak, but at the same time, she had never been one to lie. "Yes," she finally said. "I'm the one he brought in." The man looked her over, his eyes lingering on her worn clothes and the faint dust that clung to her skin. "You're lucky he found you," he said, the words unexpected but not harsh. "Not many out here would have helped. This land doesn't show mercy, especially not to women alone." The widow nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. This land was unforgiving, and survival meant more than just strength. It meant finding those rare moments of mercy, of kindness. She had found it in the warrior, in the man who had shown her a generosity she had never experienced. The man watched her for a moment, his face unreadable, before he turned and began to walk away. But then, he stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. "If you need anything," he said, "you can come to me. We don't take kindly to outsiders, but we don't turn away those who work hard." The widow was taken aback by the offer. It was the first real kindness she had received from one of the settlers. She had heard rumors about how the people here treated outsiders, especially women like her, women without family or protection. But the man's words, though simple, carried a certain weight. He wasn't offering her friendship, not yet, but he was offering her a chance to prove herself, to show that she could survive, and perhaps, in time, to be accepted. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions that stirred within her. The man gave a slight nod, then continued walking. She watched him disappear into the distance, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a small glimmer of hope. The warrior had warned her that the road ahead would not be easy, that she would have to earn her place in this world. But now, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the land, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She had people to turn to, even if they didn't fully trust her yet. And with each passing day, she would prove to them, and to herself, that she belonged here, in this place, among these people. Later that evening, as the warrior returned to check on her, he found her sitting by the fire, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. He had been gone longer than expected, dealing with matters in the settlement, but he was glad to see that she had made progress. "How was your day?" he asked, settling down beside her. "Fine," she replied, her voice calm but with a trace of something new. "I spoke with one of the settlers." The warrior raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not surprised. "And he offered me help," she said, her gaze steady. "He said I could come to him if I needed anything." The warrior considered this for a moment, then nodded. That's good. The others will come around. But remember, not all will be as kind. You must prove yourself, as I did. The widow nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had been given a chance, but it was up to her to make the most of it. I will, she said quietly, her voice filled with quiet determination. The warrior smiled, his face softening. I know you will. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, the two sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For the first time in a long time, the widow felt a sense of peace. She had been given a second chance, and this time, she wouldn't waste it. The next few days unfolded with a rhythm that was still foreign to the widow, but growing more familiar with each passing hour. The warrior's presence remained a constant, a steady force that kept the storm of uncertainty at bay. Though the people of the settlement still watched her from a distance, she had begun to find her way, slowly earning small gestures of respect from those who had once turned their backs on her. The widow's work was simple but important, tending to the small patch of land she had cleared, gathering what she could from the surroundings. The daily chores were not much, but they gave her purpose, a small reminder that life, even in this harsh place, still had value. And it was in those small tasks that she began to rediscover something she had long lost, her sense of self. But one afternoon, as she was working in the field, the wind carried with it an unsettling change. A faint smell of smoke hung in the air, sharp and acrid. The widow paused, glancing toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows over the landscape. Her instincts, honed through years of surviving on her own, told her that something was wrong. She could see it now, far in the distance, dark plumes of smoke rising into the sky. Her heart quickened, and without thinking, she turned toward the small settlement. Her first instinct was to find the warrior, to warn him. But as she made her way back, she realized something she had never allowed herself to believe. She was no longer the outsider. These people, this land, were now part of her world. The warrior had once told her that survival was a matter of more than just endurance. It was about becoming part of something, about finding a place in a world that often seemed intent on tearing people apart. And now, as she watched the smoke curl into the sky, she knew that her place was here, with these people, whether they accepted her completely or not. As she reached the settlement, her eyes scanned the surroundings, the familiar buildings now seeming fragile, vulnerable against the growing smoke in the distance. The people were already beginning to gather, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. The widow spotted a few familiar faces among them, including the man who had spoken to her a few days before. His expression was hard, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She approached him quickly, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "What's happening?" she asked, her tone firm, but edged with uncertainty. The man turned toward her, his eyes briefly softening as he saw her standing there. "Outlaws," he said simply, his voice low and tense. "They've been spotted near the pass, heading this way." The widow's heart sank as she heard the word. Outlaws were the last thing the settlement needed. The land was already unforgiving enough without having to worry about those who preyed on the weak. "How close are they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to well up inside her. "Too close," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon once more. "We need to prepare. Everyone must get inside, lock up, and stay quiet." The widow nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The people of the settlement were already moving, some running to their homes, others grabbing weapons. It was clear that the settlers were used to this kind of threat, but the widow knew that this time, it was different. This time, she had a stake in what happened next. As she stood there, the wind picking up and carrying the scent of smoke with it, she knew that she had to act. She wasn't a warrior, but she had learned in the harsh years of survival to be resourceful. She would not hide away, waiting for the danger to pass. She had faced worse in her life. She had survived worse. And now, she would fight for the people who had shown her even the smallest kindness. The warrior arrived then, his presence cutting through the tension like a knife. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his eyes scanning everything with a practiced ease. The widow's heart skipped a beat as their gazes met. He nodded at her, as if he could see the resolve in her eyes. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low, commanding. "It's too dangerous out here." The widow didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at him, her mind racing with the reality of the situation. She had come to understand that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about standing together, about taking action when needed. And she knew she couldn't sit idly by, watching as others fought. She had lived too long in a world where survival meant doing whatever it took. "I won't hide," she said quietly, her voice steady, but with the steel of someone who had made up her mind. The warrior's gaze softened, but his expression remained firm. "You don't have to fight, but you must stay safe." The widow nodded, but inside, she knew she could not stand by. She had seen too much in her life to simply wait for others to protect her. She was part of this community now, and if they were to fight, she would fight with them. As night fell, the air grew thick with tension. The settlers prepared as best as they could, securing doors and windows, gathering what weapons they had, and huddling together for protection. The widow found a quiet spot near the edge of the settlement, her eyes fixed on the smoke in the distance. She knew that when the outlaws arrived, it would be a battle like none they had faced before. But she was ready. For the first time in a long while, she felt a purpose stronger than survival, a purpose to protect what she had found here. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, growing louder. The time had come. The sound of hooves grew louder with each passing minute, echoing across the open plains as the night crept in. The widow stood firm, her eyes fixed on the distant cloud of dust that rose like a storm on the horizon. She could hear the nervous murmurs of the settlers behind her, the soft clinking of weapons being readied. But she didn't turn around. Her gaze never wavered from the approaching threat. The warrior, who had been beside her only moments before, was already organizing the defenses, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the settlement for weaknesses. He had been right to warn her to stay safe, but she was not a woman to cower. She had made her choice, and it was too late to turn back now. The outlaws were coming. The settlement was not large, and their numbers were few, but the widow had seen the brutal nature of lawlessness before. These men, the outlaws, would stop at nothing. She wasn't sure how the settlers would fare against them, but she was determined to hold her ground. The wind picked up, carrying with it the acrid scent of smoke and the faint noise of shouting in the distance. The outlaws were close now, and the widow's pulse quickened. Her heart raced, but her body was steady. She had learned long ago how to keep her fear hidden, to keep it from showing on her face. As the warrior approached her again, his face set in a mask of determination, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but firm. The widow's gaze met his, and for the briefest moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a fleeting sense of concern, maybe even a trace of fear. But it was gone in an instant. "I won't," she replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm not going to hide." The warrior's gaze softened for a moment, his expression unreadable, but he did not argue. He had come to know this woman's strength, her determination, and he knew that once she made up her mind, there was no changing it. "Then I will stay by your side," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of a promise. The widow nodded, grateful for his presence. Though she had been alone for so long, she had come to trust the warrior. He was her protector, but in these moments, it felt as though they were equals, standing together against the encroaching darkness. The first shots rang out in the distance, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the night. The widow's heart skipped a beat. The outlaws had arrived. She turned toward the sound of the gunfire, her instincts kicking in. There was no time for fear now, no time for hesitation. The settlement had to hold. She moved quickly, her footsteps light as she made her way toward the edge of the settlement, where she could get a better view of the unfolding battle. The warrior followed closely behind her, his hand never straying far from his weapon. As they reached the outskirts of the settlement, they saw the first of the outlaws riding in, their horses galloping swiftly across the plains. The widow's breath caught in her chest. There were 5 of them, all heavily armed and riding with the confidence of men who had taken what they wanted without consequence. "Stay behind me," the warrior said, his voice firm as he positioned himself in front of her. She obeyed without hesitation, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife she had carried since her days on the farm. She had never been a fighter, but she had learned to defend herself when necessary. The outlaws rode closer, their horses kicking up dust as they neared the settlement. The warrior stood tall, his posture unyielding, his eyes cold and calculating. He was ready, and the widow could feel the tension in the air, thick as the desert night. The outlaws slowed as they neared, their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, leading the charge. He looked at the warrior, his eyes narrowing. "We've come for what's ours," he said, his voice rough, "and we don't take kindly to strangers." The warrior's voice was steady, unwavering. "You'll take nothing here," he replied, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "Leave now, while you still can." The outlaw leader let out a low chuckle, clearly unimpressed. "You think you can stop us? This land belongs to no one but those who take it." The widow's heart raced as she stood behind the warrior, her hand still resting on the knife at her side. She had heard these kinds of threats before, and she knew how they ended. But something about the warrior's stance, his calm demeanor, filled her with a quiet strength. The outlaws began to move in, their eyes flicking between the warrior and the widow, sizing them up. The widow's grip tightened on her knife. She had been given a second chance at life, and she wasn't going to let it be taken away so easily. The warrior's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Leave now, or you will regret it," he said, his tone cold, final. The outlaw leader hesitated, his eyes flicking to the other men, who were now shifting in their saddles, unsure of how to proceed. It was a moment of indecision, and the warrior used it to his advantage. With a quick motion, he drew his weapon and fired. The shot rang out, sharp and clean, striking the outlaw leader in the chest. He fell from his horse with a grunt, the sound of his body hitting the ground heavy in the night air. The other outlaws froze, momentarily stunned by the sudden violence. The widow's heart pounded in her chest as the scene unfolded before her. But she didn't flinch. She had faced worse. She had survived worse. And now, she would stand beside the warrior, no matter the cost. The remaining outlaws exchanged uncertain glances, and it was in that moment of hesitation that the warriors of the settlement struck. The battle that followed was brutal but swift. The outlaws, thrown off balance by the unexpected defense, were driven back, their numbers dwindling under the determined resistance of the settlers. As the final outlaw fell, the silence that followed was almost deafening. The widow stood beside the warrior, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The battle was over. They had won. But as the dust settled, and the smoke from the gunfire drifted away, the widow realized something deep inside her had changed. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the weak woman waiting for rescue. She had found her strength, not in hiding or in waiting, but in standing her ground. And as the warrior turned to her, his eyes filled with pride, she knew that this was only the beginning of the path they would walk together. The days following the battle were marked by a new sense of unity in the settlement. The widow, though still an outsider in many eyes, had proven herself not just a survivor, but a fighter. The warrior had seen to the wounded, while the settlers began to rebuild what had been damaged. As the smoke of the outlaw's presence faded into memory, the widow found herself standing at a new crossroads. The fight was over, but the path ahead remained unclear. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the plains, casting its warm light on the settlement, the widow found herself standing alone near the edge of the land, watching the horizon stretch out before her. The events of the past few days had shaken her, but they had also given her clarity. She had fought alongside the settlers, alongside the warrior, and in that moment, she knew there was no going back. She was no longer a woman waiting to be rescued. She was part of something bigger, something worth protecting. The warrior found her there, standing by herself, her face calm, but her eyes reflecting a storm of emotions. He approached her quietly, not wanting to startle her, but she sensed his presence and turned to face him. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "Too quiet." She smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in days. "I've been thinking," she replied softly, "about what comes next." The warrior regarded her with his usual calm, though there was something in his gaze that suggested he too had been thinking. "You've earned your place here," he said after a pause, his voice filled with quiet approval. "You fought for them, and they will remember that." The widow looked away, her eyes scanning the vast land before her. The settlement behind her was small, but it was hers now, and the people who had once viewed her with suspicion were beginning to see her as more than just an outsider. "I don't want to just survive anymore," she said, her voice firm. "I want to help. I want to build something here, for myself, for them." The warrior nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You've always had that fire in you," he said, though it was clear he was still adjusting to the idea of her wanting to stay. "But it's not always easy. You've seen what happens when people fight to protect what they have. It's a life full of hardship." The widow looked back at him, her eyes steady. "I know," she said, "but I've lived through enough hardship to know that life isn't worth living without something to fight for." The warrior studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke. "Then stay. Stay and fight. Fight for this place, for these people. But know that the road ahead won't be without challenges. It will never be easy." She nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "I'm ready for whatever comes," she said. The warrior turned to walk away, but paused before he left her side. "I know you are," he said quietly. "And when the time comes, I will stand beside you." The widow stood there long after he had gone, the wind rustling through the grass at her feet. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a protector, a fighter, a part of something worth defending. The days grew longer, and with each passing one, the widow found herself more deeply embedded in the fabric of the settlement. She helped where she could, from mending fences to helping tend the crops, and though the work was often hard, it gave her a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and it was a life worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, the widow grew closer to the settlers. She shared meals with them, laughed with them, and, in time, began to feel a sense of belonging that she had thought impossible. But there were still challenges to face. A threat that had been simmering beneath the surface of the settlement began to rise. The warriors of the tribe, including the widow, had seen signs of increased activity from other outlaw groups nearby, and it was clear that another battle might be on the horizon. The widow had proven herself in the first fight, but she knew that this new threat would require even more from her. The warrior approached her one evening as the sun set, the sky glowing with vibrant reds and oranges. "There are whispers of a new group of outlaws in the area," he said, his voice low. "They're not like the ones we fought before. They're more organized, more ruthless." The widow nodded, her expression hardening. She had known this day would come. "How soon?" she asked. "Soon enough," he replied. "We need to be ready." The widow stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her like a storm cloud. She had no choice but to stand with the settlers again. She had made her decision. She would fight for them, no matter the cost. "We'll be ready," she said, her voice filled with the resolve of someone who had nothing left to lose. The warrior studied her for a long moment, then nodded, a rare flicker of respect in his eyes. "I knew you would be," he said. And so, as the days turned into weeks, the widow and the warrior prepared for the next challenge. They trained together, honing their skills, readying themselves for whatever lay ahead. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The widow had found her place in this world, and she would not back down from the fight. The quiet before the storm was thick, hanging in the air like a heavy blanket. The widow stood near the edge of the settlement once again, her eyes scanning the horizon where the first hints of dawn touched the earth. The landscape before her was vast, the same as it had always been, but now it felt different. There was a tension in the air, a weight she couldn't shake. The warrior had left early that morning, preparing his people, coordinating the defenses of the settlement. The news of the new outlaw group had spread quickly, and everyone was on edge, ready for whatever came next. The widow had grown used to the rhythm of life here, but today, it was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. She didn't like the feeling. The preparation was thorough, but something about this group of outlaws was different. They were organized, dangerous, and they knew exactly how to strike. The widow had heard whispers of their methods, their ruthless efficiency, and the way they left destruction in their wake. She had fought once before, but this time it felt like the stakes were higher. She was no longer a stranger. She had become part of the settlement, a part of the people. She couldn't afford to stand on the sidelines. She was committed. As the hours passed, the settlement grew quieter. People went about their tasks, but their movements were faster, more purposeful. They knew what was coming. The widow was no different. She had spent the last few days preparing, sharpening her skills, training with the warrior, learning to defend herself and her new home. The warrior had taught her well, and she knew now that she was ready. She was no longer the fragile woman who had wandered into the settlement weeks ago, exhausted and broken. She had found her strength, and with it, a sense of purpose. The warrior found her as the sun began to set, its light casting long shadows over the land. His face was grim, his eyes reflecting the weight of what was about to happen. "They're close," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We'll need to move quickly." The widow nodded, her heart steady. She had known this moment would come, but she wasn't afraid. She was ready to fight for what she had found here, for the people who had come to accept her. "Where do you need me?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a trace of urgency. The warrior gave her a quick look of approval before nodding toward the edge of the settlement. "We'll hold the line here," he said. "The outlaws will try to breach the defenses. Stay sharp, and remember what we've practiced." The widow followed him without hesitation, her hand resting on the hilt of her weapon. The settlement had prepared as best as they could. Barricades were in place, weapons were distributed, and every man, woman, and child had been assigned a role. It was a makeshift defense, but it was all they had. The warrior positioned himself at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The widow took her place beside him, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but there was no fear, only focus. "They'll come at night," the warrior said softly, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "That's when they strike." The widow nodded, her senses heightened. As nightfall approached, the air grew cooler, the wind picking up as if in anticipation. The settlers gathered in their positions, each one bracing for the inevitable. The widow could hear the distant sound of hooves again, faint but growing louder. The outlaws were almost here. "Get ready," the warrior said, his voice steady. "They'll come fast. Don't hesitate." The widow's grip tightened on her weapon. She was ready. As the first of the outlaws came into view, riding hard toward the settlement, the tension in the air snapped. The warrior moved into action, his body fluid and swift, cutting through the night like a shadow. The widow followed, her instincts guiding her as she stepped into the fray. The outlaws rode in fast, their horses thundering across the ground. There were fewer of them than she had anticipated, but they were vicious, their eyes cold with intent. The widow faced one of them, a man whose face was obscured by a mask. He swung his weapon at her, but she was quick, dodging his strike and countering with a swift, calculated movement. The battle was chaotic, the sounds of steel clashing against steel, the cries of men and horses filled the air. But in the midst of it all, the widow's focus remained sharp. She wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore. She was fighting for the people who had taken her in, for the home she had begun to build. With every strike, every parry, she felt herself becoming more than just a survivor. She was a protector. She was one of them. The warrior fought beside her, his movements precise and deadly. Together, they held their ground, pushing back the outlaws who dared to invade their home. The widow could feel the strength of the settlement behind her, the unity of a people who had come together to defend what was theirs. As the night wore on, the tide of the battle began to shift. The outlaws, though fierce, were no match for the determined settlers who fought with everything they had. The widow fought alongside the warrior, her heart steady, her mind clear. They were not just defending a piece of land. They were defending their lives, their future. When the last of the outlaws were driven off, the silence that followed was heavy with exhaustion. The widow stood amid the aftermath, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had fought alongside the warriors, had proven her strength, and now, the settlement was safe. For the first time, she felt that she truly belonged here. The warrior came to her side, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice filled with respect. The widow nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "We did well," she replied, her gaze steady as she looked out over the settlement. They had won, and in that victory, she had found her place. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now, for the first time, she knew she had a purpose. And with that purpose, she would face whatever came next. The days after the battle were filled with a heavy silence that settled over the settlement like a blanket. The widow, along with the other settlers, had fought hard and seen their home defended. The night had been long and the battle intense, but they had emerged victorious. As the sun rose over the plains, casting its golden light on the landscape, the widow stood by the edge of the settlement, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had fought for this place, for these people, and now, as the dust from the battle settled, she realized something deep within herself had shifted. The fear that had gripped her when she first arrived here was gone, replaced by something far stronger: purpose. Her heart no longer felt like it was carrying the weight of the past. It was lighter now, filled with a sense of belonging that she had never known before. She was part of this place, and the people of the settlement, though still wary at times, had begun to accept her as one of their own. She had proven herself not just as a survivor, but as a fighter, and in doing so, she had earned their respect. The warrior had been by her side through it all. He had been the steady force that had kept her grounded, the protector who had led them both through the dangers they had faced. But there was something more now, something between them that neither had spoken of, but both understood. It wasn't just gratitude or respect. It was a bond forged through the fires of battle, a silent understanding that went deeper than words. As the widow stood there, contemplating the future, she heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw the warrior approaching, his expression unreadable as always, but there was a certain gentleness in his gaze that spoke volumes. He came to a stop beside her, his gaze following hers as he too looked out over the settlement. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with an unspoken weight. "For now," she replied, her voice steady. "But I know this place will always be a target. It's never truly over." He nodded, his eyes still focused on the horizon. "You're right. But we've shown them we're not so easy to take." The widow smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride. "We have," she agreed. They stood together in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared experiences hanging in the air between them. Finally, the warrior spoke again, his voice softer now. "You've earned your place here," he said, his words simple but filled with meaning. "You've proven yourself to them, to me, and to yourself." The widow felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew what he meant. She had come to this land a broken woman, unsure of where she belonged. But now, she stood tall, her head held high. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I wouldn't have made it without you." The warrior didn't respond at first, but after a moment, he turned to face her. "You did it yourself," he said simply. "I only showed you the way." She met his gaze then, her eyes softening. "I didn't know the way at first," she admitted. "But I do now." He smiled then, a rare, small smile that reached his eyes and made something inside her stir. It was the first time she had seen him smile like that, and it warmed her heart. For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, watching the world unfold before them. It felt peaceful in a way she hadn't known was possible. The warrior finally broke the silence. "The settlement still needs protection," he said, his tone shifting back to business. "But with you here, we can stand strong. Together." She nodded, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "Together," she repeated. As the days turned into weeks, the widow continued to help where she could. She worked alongside the other settlers, rebuilding what had been damaged during the attack and reinforcing the settlement's defenses. The warrior was always close by, keeping watch, but now, their roles had changed. They worked together, side by side, no longer as leader and follower, but as equals. The widow had earned her place, and with each day that passed, she felt more and more like she belonged. The settlers had come to trust her, to see her not as the outsider she once was, but as someone who had fought for their home. They were stronger because of it. The days were filled with hard work, but they also brought moments of laughter, of shared stories around the fire, of growing bonds that held the settlement together. But even in the midst of their small victories, the widow knew the world beyond them was still uncertain. The warrior had warned her that their peace could be short-lived, that the outlaws would not stop coming. But for now, she had found something worth protecting. And that was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden light over the settlement, the warrior and the widow stood side by side once again. They had come a long way from the first time they had met, and though the future remained uncertain, there was no doubt in her mind now. She was where she was meant to be, and with the warrior by her side, she knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. "We're ready," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. The warrior nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We are." Together, they faced the unknown, ready to protect the land they had fought for, the community they had built, and each other. Weeks passed since the battle that had cemented the widow's place in the settlement. The days were long and filled with work, but they were also filled with a quiet satisfaction. She had found purpose, something she had never known in the years before. The warrior, always at her side, had been a steady presence. He was her protector, her equal, and perhaps something more. Together, they had made the settlement stronger, ready for whatever came next. Yet, even as the days passed, the widow couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something she couldn't yet see. The winds of change were in the air. One evening, after a long day of repairs, the widow stood by the edge of the settlement once again. She looked out over the land, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but her mind was focused on something else. The warrior approached her, his footsteps light in the stillness of the evening. "You're thinking again," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet understanding. The widow didn't turn to face him, but she didn't need to. She knew he could see it in her eyes. "I'm wondering how long this peace will last," she said, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of her thoughts. The warrior stood beside her, looking out at the land as well. "The world doesn't stay quiet for long," he replied, his voice low. "But we can make it last as long as we can." The widow nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We've done what we can to fortify this place, but there's always something out there. I can feel it." The warrior was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with quiet conviction. "Then we will be ready for it." They stood together, side by side. As the last light of day faded away, the stars beginning to appear in the clear sky above. The widow felt a sense of peace, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the peace they had fought for was fragile, and she would not let it slip away without a fight. As the days passed, the widow grew more attuned to the rhythms of life in the settlement. The warrior had shown her how to defend herself, how to stand strong, and she had taken those lessons to heart. But she had also learned that strength wasn't just about fighting. It was about knowing when to act, when to protect, and when to stand firm. She had found her place here, but it was a place that required constant vigilance. One morning, as the widow was working near the outskirts of the settlement, she heard the sound of horses approaching. At first, she thought it was just the settlers, but something about the sound set her on edge. She paused, listening intently. The hoofbeats were fast, deliberate, and there were more than a few. Her hand instinctively went to the knife at her side, her breath quickening as she scanned the horizon. She saw them then, figures on horseback, moving swiftly toward the settlement. They were too far to identify yet, but the widow's heart raced. This wasn't a simple patrol. This was something else. She hurried back toward the center of the settlement, her steps quick and purposeful. The warrior was already there, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the approaching riders. "Get inside," he said, his voice low but urgent. The widow didn't argue. She had learned long ago to trust his instincts. She moved quickly, but her mind was racing. Who were these riders? Were they allies or enemies? As she reached the safety of the buildings, she looked back at the warrior. He had already mounted his horse, preparing to ride out and meet the approaching riders. The widow's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't stand by while the warrior faced whatever threat was coming. Without hesitation, she followed him, her steps quick and determined. "Stay back," the warrior called over his shoulder, his voice firm but with an edge of concern. "This isn't your fight." The widow didn't listen. She had made her choice long ago. She wasn't going to hide while others fought. She was part of this settlement now, and she would fight to protect it. The warriors of the settlement were gathering, readying themselves for whatever came next. The widow moved to join them, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands steady. They had fought before, but this time, it felt different. The air was thick with anticipation. The riders were close now, and the widow could see them clearly. They were a group of men, their faces hardened with experience, their eyes cold with intent. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, rode at the front. The widow's instincts flared. These weren't friendly riders. The warrior, sensing the same, moved forward to meet them. The widow stood at the ready, her eyes never leaving the group. She wasn't going to let them take this settlement, not without a fight. The tall man on horseback stopped a few yards away from the warrior, his gaze scanning the group before landing on the widow. "We've been told you have something we want," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. "And we'll take it by force if we must." The widow's grip tightened on her knife, her heart steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of her mind. The warrior didn't flinch. "You'll take nothing here," he said, his voice filled with the calm confidence of someone who had been through this before. The leader of the riders sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "We'll see about that," he said, signaling for his men to advance. The battle that followed was swift, but fierce. The widow fought with all the strength she had, her movements sharp and precise. She wasn't just defending her home, she was defending the life she had built here, the people she had come to care for. The warrior fought beside her, his presence a steady force, guiding her through the chaos. The outlaws were fierce, but they were no match for the united front of the settlers. Together, they held their ground. As the last of the riders fell, the widow stood amidst the aftermath, her breath coming in quick gasps. The settlement was safe once again. The warrior stood beside her, his expression unreadable but with a flicker of approval in his eyes. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice filled with respect. The widow met his gaze, her heart swelling with pride. "We did well," she said, her voice steady, filled with a quiet determination. She had found her place here, and she would fight to protect it, no matter what came next. The battle was over, and the silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of what had been won. The widow stood amidst the wreckage of the fight, her chest rising and falling as she took in the sight of the fallen riders. Her hands, still clutching her weapon, trembled slightly from the exertion. The last of the outlaws had been driven off, their bodies scattered across the dirt, their horses either fled or captured. But even in the victory, there was a quiet sorrow in the air. The settlement had suffered damage, some homes were destroyed, and a few settlers had been wounded, though none fatally. The widow's eyes met the warrior's as he approached, his face stoic as ever, but there was a flicker of pride in his gaze. "You fought well," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She nodded, her breath steadying as she looked at the faces around her. "We fought well," she corrected him, her voice carrying the strength of a shared victory. The warrior gave her a nod, acknowledging her words. He surveyed the damage, his eyes sharp as he took in the fallen riders, the broken homes, and the wounded settlers. "It's not over," he said, his tone somber. "The outlaws will come again. It's not a matter of if, but when." The widow's heart sank at his words. She had hoped that this would be the last of them, but deep down, she had known the fight was far from finished. "We'll be ready," she said, the words coming more from instinct than anything else. The warrior's eyes flicked to her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We will be." The settlers, though shaken, were already beginning to pick up the pieces. The wounded were tended to, the dead buried, and the damage to the settlement assessed. It was clear that this small victory had come at a high cost, but it was a victory nonetheless. The widow moved among the people, offering help where she could. She had fought beside them, and now, in the aftermath, she felt the need to contribute in any way she could. She helped carry water to the wounded, helped rebuild makeshift barricades, and offered words of comfort to those who had lost loved ones. But even as she worked, her mind kept returning to the warrior's words. The outlaws would return, and when they did, the settlement would need to be ready. That night, as the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle overhead, the widow sat alone on the porch of the small building she called home. The sounds of the settlement, people talking, working, repairing, faded into the background as she thought about the days to come. She had found her place here, but the reality of life on the frontier was ever present. The peace they had fought for was fragile, and the future uncertain. The warrior approached her quietly, his footsteps soft on the ground. He sat down beside her, his posture relaxed but alert. "You're thinking again," he said, his voice low. She turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's hard not to," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "There's so much to consider." He didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know," he said finally, his tone thoughtful. "But we've done something that no one thought possible. We've held our ground." The widow nodded, her gaze drifting to the stars above. "For now," she said quietly. "But there's still so much to do." The warrior didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, he spoke again. "You're ready for it," he said. You've always been ready. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. I wasn't ready when I first came here, she said, her voice tinged with the weight of the past. But now I am. Now, I know what I'm fighting for. The warrior's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability, a recognition of the strength they had both found in each other. We all have our reasons, he said quietly, and we all have our battles to fight. But together, we'll face whatever comes next. The widow's heart swelled at his words. She had fought alongside him, stood beside him through the toughest moments, and now, she realized, they were more than just allies. They were a team. They were stronger together, and that strength would carry them forward. The days ahead would not be easy. The outlaws would come again, and the threat of violence would always linger over the settlement. But in that moment, with the warrior by her side and the stars shining above, the widow felt ready. Ready to face whatever the future held, ready to protect what she had fought for. Together, she repeated, her voice filled with quiet resolve. We'll face it together. The warrior nodded, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. Together. And so, the widow knew that as long as they stood side by side, they could face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her place, her purpose, and with it, the strength to protect it. The fight was far from over, but with the warrior by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with a quiet peace, a peace that the widow had never truly known. The outlaws had been pushed back, and for now, the settlement was safe. But the widow knew better than to rest on her laurels. She had seen enough of this world to understand that peace was always temporary, and the next storm was always just beyond the horizon. Yet, as she stood by the edge of the settlement one evening, watching the sun set over the plains, there was no fear in her heart. There was only a quiet strength, a deep-rooted belief that no matter what came next, she was ready. She had found her place in this world, not just as a survivor, but as someone who would fight for the life she had built. The warrior stood beside her, his presence a constant comfort, his steady gaze scanning the horizon just as hers did. They had both changed in the time since their first meeting, shaped by the battles they had fought together, by the losses they had endured, and by the quiet moments in between. The widow turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a sense of understanding that had grown between them over the months. Do you think it will ever end? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The fighting, the struggle, will it ever truly end? The warrior's gaze remained on the horizon, but his voice was steady, reassuring. No, he said simply. It may never end, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting. The widow nodded, taking comfort in his words. She had learned, over the course of her time here, that life wasn't about the battles won or lost. It was about what you fought for, and she had found something worth fighting for. We keep going, she said, her voice firm with resolve. We keep fighting. The warrior turned to her, his eyes softening as he met her gaze. You've come a long way, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. I've never met anyone like you. The widow smiled faintly, her heart swelling at his words. I've learned a lot from you, she replied. More than I ever thought possible. The warrior didn't speak for a moment, as if considering her words. Carefully. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, almost hesitant. You've proven yourself to me, to the settlers, and to yourself. You're one of us now. A part of this place, a part of this fight. The widow's heart fluttered in her chest. She had always thought of herself as an outsider, a woman who had been cast aside by the world. But now, as she stood here, by his side, she realized that she was no longer an outsider. She was a part of something bigger. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. For everything. The warrior nodded, his expression softening. You've earned it, he said simply. We all have our battles to fight. But we don't fight alone. The widow smiled, the weight of his words settling in her heart. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found her place here, in this world that was harsh and unforgiving, but also full of strength, of unity, of purpose. And as long as she stood by the warrior, by the people who had become her family, she knew she would never be alone. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The widow continued to stand by the warrior, her heart full of the quiet pride of someone who had found their purpose. She fought for the settlement, for the people who had taken her in, for the life she had built. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. She would face whatever came next with the same strength and resolve that had carried her this far. The warrior and the widow fought side by side, facing the challenges of the frontier together. And as the years passed, their bond only grew stronger, forged in the fire of battle, tempered by the quiet moments they shared. Together, they had built something worth fighting for. And together, they would continue to fight, for each other, for the settlement, and for the life they had created. The sun set on the horizon once more, the sky painted with the soft hues of twilight, and as the widow stood beside the warrior, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. No matter what the world threw at them, they were ready. They had each other, and that was all they needed.